Good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to our penultimate seminar in our seminar series. And good evening to everyone joining in from India and Southeast Asia. This seminar series has been themed on the digital future for business and society, perspectives on AI challenges and opportunities. This is hosted jointly by Professor Yogesh Dwivedi, who is Professor of Digital Marketing and Innovation and the founding director of the Emerging Markets Research Center and co-director of research at the School of Management, Swansea University, Wales, UK. Our co-host for the seminar series is Dr. Raman, Director, Symbiosis Institute of Business Management and Dean, Faculty of Management at Symbiosis International University. Allow me to take you through a little explanation of what this seminar series is all about. This series has been supported by the Center for Technology, Innovation, Management and Enterprise at the University of Kent, UK, the Digital Marketing and Analytics Special Industry Group, Academy of Marketing, Grenoble IAE Graduate School of Management, a Grenoble INP school of the University of Grenoble Alps, the Swansea iLab Innovation Lab at the Swansea University, the e-business and the e-government Special Industry Group, British Academy of Management, and the UK Academy for Information Systems. This seminar series is inspired by various perspectives on artificial intelligence and its transformative potential as presented in a recent perspective article by Dwivedi et al. 2019. AI undoubtedly offers a transformative potential for the augmentation and potential replacement of human tasks within a wide range of industrial, intellectual, social applications. The pace of change for this new AI technological age is staggering, with new breakthroughs in algorithmic machine learning and autonomous decision-making, creating new opportunities for continued innovation. The impact of AI can be significant, with industries and sectors ranging from agriculture, finance, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, supply chain, logistics, and utilities, all potentially disrupted by the onset of AI technologies. This seminar series will present various perspectives from a number of leading expert speakers to highlight both the opportunities and challenges posed by the rapid emergence of AI. Allow me now to tell you a little bit about our distinguished speaker for today afternoon. Dr. Crispin Coombs is a reader in information systems in the School of Business and Economics, Loughborough University, UK. His research expertise concerns the effective management of artificial intelligence and robotics to deliver business benefits. His work is highly cited and has been published in the top business and management journals, including the Journal of Strategic Information Systems, European Journal of Information Systems, Information and Management, Information Technology and People, and the Journal of Organizational Behavior. He holds senior editorial positions at the European Journal of Information Systems, Information Technology and People, and International Journal of Information Management. And he does a huge amount of work at a country level in the United Kingdom. Today, Dr. Crispin Coombs will talk to us about what is it about humanity that we can't give away to intelligent machines. Welcome, Dr. Crispin Coombs, once again, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhattacharya, and thank you also for the invitation, Yogesh, to speak here today. I shall just endeavour to do the magic sharing of the screen, which hopefully you can see now.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. And thank you again for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to begin by giving you a little bit of an overview of the structure of my talk. We've seen with recent advances in artificial intelligence that it's now being possible to create what we might describe as these new intelligent machines. And this has led to debates and tensions between whether we are giving up our human freedom, our academic freedom, but more fundamentally our human freedom, and intelligent machine control. Are there tensions between those things? Who should have control and how should we manage this? And what I'm going to talk about today is our workshop-based study that looked at these tensions in 4 particular contexts. So we looked at them in the context of crime and conflict, jobs and employment, attention in the attention economy, but also human well-being. And what I'll argue and what the crux of the message of this talk and presentation comes out of this is 3 points, really. That it's essential that as humans, we must preserve our ability to critique artificial intelligence. We must be able to challenge it and have our voice heard and push back. There's an interesting, and you'll see through some of the points I'll make and the discussions that came through in our workshop, the involvement of humans in AI decision making and how the human is retained within the loop is also a critical point. And there's a real emphasis from our study that actually this is essential. In some way or form, humans must always be retained in AI decision making. And third, that explainable AI is critical to enable those first 2 points to be achieved. And there needs to be a real focus on trying to make sure explainable AI is possible and so forth. What I'll conclude with is a research agenda for how we see future AI and humanity research. But as I go through the presentation, there'll be lots of points where you will get a sense of the types of questions that I'll summarize towards the end again. So I'll go back to our research agenda, but you'll get a feel of that as we progress. The talk today is very much a product of a network endeavor. We are delighted it was accepted for publication at the International Journal of Information Management, and it very much contributes to the ongoing discussion that's already been published in many articles within that journal, looking at issues and challenges raised by AI. And I would encourage you to sort of look at the journal and look, if you're interested in this topic, there's a huge wealth looking at the future of work, strategic management of AI, AI decision making, and so forth. So there's a lot of really useful and valuable articles that are coming out in the journal there, and I would definitely sort of vote for sort of looking in that discipline to get a greater understanding. I'm also pleased that, as I say, this article was published, but as I'll mention in the second, the European Centre for Information Systems were kind enough to be able to allow us to make this journal gold open access. So if you wish to read the journal and you can hear and look in more depth about what I'll talk about today, the URL is at the bottom of the screen there, but it is freely available globally. So we hope it is useful to the community in that respect. The article in my talk is something that was conceived by the ERSYS network. The European Research Centre on Information Systems is a network of information systems groups across Europe, but beyond, to be honest, because as you can see from the map, it includes places such as Australia, New Zealand, USA, and Brazil. It's headquartered in Munster, and Loughborough University is part of this network. And every year we have a workshop that brings the community together, which is an assembly of around 40 information systems researchers. On the occasion of the workshop I'm referring to this event, we had 10 different countries represented, including many obviously across Europe, but also Brazil. And what we wanted to do as part of our workshop series was to try and tackle some of the most pertinent and pressing issues of our time, which led us to focus, first of all, looking at artificial intelligence and how it may be influencing humanity. Consequently, and as a product of a network endeavor, we had a large author team, and these are my co-authors, and it sort of reflects the collaborative nature of this article. My thanks, obviously, to them and their contributions. Without them, this article would not exist, and neither would this talk. And what I'm presenting today is very much a summary of their collective views of AI and humanity, but also the discussions that emerged from our workshop. So this is a sort of a synthesis of the key thoughts emerging from 40 information systems researchers, primarily from Europe, coming from a range of different philosophical perspectives and also methodological backgrounds. So this is all synthesis together to bring the insights we have today. So that set the scene. Let's begin by focusing on some of the key points and if you like, our point of departure. And this was also the point of departure for our workshop. So we began by taking in Patrick Stacey, a colleague of mine at Loughborough University's perspective on what the future intelligent machines might be. And he pointed us towards a quote from Irving Good, a mathematician that worked alongside Alan Turing at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. And he was very much, again, interested in AI and the thinking machine and what might this mean. And writing in, I think it was 1965, he argued that an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There could then be unquestionably be an intelligence explosion. And essentially the intelligence of man would be left far behind. He was painting the rather bleak picture that if such ultra-intelligent machines could actually be created, then suddenly we might be left behind and we have this intelligence explosion and suddenly we are not in control anymore. It's very much playing on the should we say, the Terminator, sort of, if we're looking for a science fiction perspective, but that concern of machines taking over the world. Now, to reassure you, it sort of goes like today's standard, as Stacey would call them, intelligent machines are not there yet. We are not seeing that. They're not surpassing our own intelligence. Although in some respects, their computational power is certainly greater than what we can do, the way they can process data, the way they can perform calculations far exceeds human capabilities. But what it points out is that we still retain some intellectual edge. We have an essential role to play at the moment. And also we have our own human values, which are essential to hold on to. And so we would argue that we need to hang on to and focus on those human intellectual artifacts, as well as unsupervised AI and robotics, the technological artifacts. And what Stacey argues is that actually IS and information systems has a focus so much on the IT artifact and its fascination most recently with theory in terms of social materiality, that actually this may be problematic to ourselves. We are actually paying so much attention to the technology, we are starting to marginalize the human user and therefore the maker we are creating it. So Patrick would argue for a new humanism. We need to revert back to thinking around the human agent as our primary unit of analysis and concern. So a re-leveling, if you like, moving away from our fascination purely on the technology, but also getting a real focus on that human role. So Patrick calls for a new humanism, in which certainly sort of established a gentle Kantian and Frankfurtian concepts are foregrounded. So what do we mean by sort of Kantian reason and these sorts of concepts? Just to give a very brief sense of this. Kant's, and you can see him in the picture, Kant's view was that humans are distinct and unique because they freely find an imperative to follow. We decide how we want to live our lives. We find our own meaning in life. And this imperative is forged from our architecture of the mind. So and the way we think about things is that, first of all, we have our sensibilities, how we understand the world and how we reason about the world. So what you might say is that reason is ultimately our biggest expression of freedom, being idealistic and creative, the fact that we can do things and come up with new expressions, and having the opportunity to articulate our reason is key to show that we are free. But when machines start to threaten those ideals, if you like, our ability to have creative idealistic critique, if it's under attack, then perhaps we're in trouble. Let me give you an example. Microsoft has already produced an AI-informed original artwork, an original Rembrandt. That's how they positioned it. So you think of Rembrandt, the great artist. Actually, there's now Microsoft as an example using machine learning to produce forms of art. So we're actually getting pictures, and you sort of think, well, this has always been the location, the skill set that we would uniquely associate with humans. Does that mean that our creativity is under threat? Now, just because artificial intelligence and machines can create art, that doesn't stop us from creating art ourselves. That isn't the problem. It doesn't actually abuse our own ability to create art. So we just coexist, that's fine. However, when AI and machines are used to curate human artists and decide which art is actually seen, then that's a different question. That starts to become a different issue altogether. So that is our point of departure. Is this really the case as intelligent machines come through? Do we lose that sense of control and power along the way? And how should we manage it? So that, in essence, was our point of departure for the workshop. So we had a session, which I've briefly alluded to from Stacey, looking at towards a new humanism. So we use that as a kind of provocation, if you like, to get us thinking, to get people in the room thinking about actually what are the tensions here, what are the challenges. And to go about it, we identified four themes to investigate. Crime and conflict, jobs, the attention economy, and well-being. And we identified those four themes in advance because they're widely debated in the literature, and also we see a lot of comment around these sorts of issues in public discourse. But before we went into our workshop activity, we also had an open discussion across the room just to see if there was anything else we'd missed, any other issues, and four areas came through that all seemed pertinent. So bias, ethics, responsibility, and control. So what we decided to do, and as you sort of see illustrated in the slide, is create a sort of matrix approach. So whenever we were talking about crime and conflict, we were prompting questions and discussion around issues of bias, ethics, responsibility, and control, and so forth. The method we adopted was a World Cafe workshop, which is actually quite a well-known established process. You may have used it before, you may be familiar, but if you aren't, if you just Google World Cafe workshop, you'll find the template for the method. It's very effective, and it's very engaging, and it's good for generating debate across different areas. So what we had was 4 tables, as you can see in the photo, with one table focusing on each theme. And each table had a host, and that host person stayed on the table throughout the process of the exercise. And you can see that this is clearly pre-2020. This was done in 2019 because there's no social distancing, and look at us all in a nice space together. Let's look forward to times when we can all exist in that way again. So our hosts, which you'll see, we've got Xiao standing up there, Armin, centre of shot in the top right as well, Christian, bottom left, and Niels, I think you can just see in the background there. Their role was to collate the discussion, so to capture the key points that were being made and write those down on post-its. We had 3 cafe rotations, so each of the hosts stayed on the table, but after 20 minutes, everybody was sitting at that table, got up together, moved around to another table, sat down, and then proceeded to have a further discussion on each theme. That way, we ensured that we had a wide variety of perspectives and comments and views being taken into account, and each member of our audience, if you like, had the opportunity to discuss different areas along the way. After we did the rotations, each of the table hosts then gave a brief summary back to the group of the key findings that emerged from the table discussions. In terms of bringing it together, we used those post-its. You can see we captured them on a flip chart, photographed them, and shared them with table hosts. My colleague at Loughborough, Boyka Samanova, she reviewed all the post-its and created a matrix. So you see that earlier matrix. So we tried to fit some of the, if you like, the data into that matrix of themes and cross-cutting issues, and they were then shared with those table hosts. And then we invited, and I'm delighted to say they accepted, Patrick and the table hosts to write up their contributions for the purposes of the paper. So I shall now, oops, let me just move that on. So I shall now move on to the crux of this and say, well, okay, what were the themes? What sort of things did emerge from these discussions? What did we find? So our first theme was crime and conflict, and that was written up by Niels Garman-Johnson from the University of Vega and Marcelo Fantino from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And the first area was looking at, and they raised the concerns around, oh, I've jumped on too many, sorry, around bias. And they flagged that machines need to be calibrated to make predictions of human behavior. So we need to think about how we're going to calibrate these machines. And we're going to use that to compare it to actual behavior. However, if the machines that we're creating are biased, then they're not providing an advantage over human decision-making. So if you think about it in a courtroom environment, as illustrated there, if you have a jury and you've got human decision makers, and we know and we're concerned that obviously humans can be biased, but actually if the machines and the decision making that we're using with AI are also biased, we're not improving on this. This is not a step forward. So our challenge here is to develop technical skills to diminish bias. We need to find ways to avoid AI essentially making our mistakes because it is designed and trained using historical data that has bias inherently inbuilt in it. So one of the first things to come out of these discussions was actually, could this mean that we're going to see a new phase of information systems develop, a new type of way of designing information systems to try and manage that bias and that behavior? And how can we reduce the risk of it going through? Because fundamentally, if the machines are biased, we're no further forward. So that was one of the first points coming through. And also from an ethical point of view, Niels and the group looking at crime and conflict argued that they have to make better decisions than us. They have to support higher level decision making, shall we say, not necessarily better decisions than us, but allowing us as a society to make better decisions that are more socially beneficial and are more engaged with humans. So we need to be able to use these technologies to build better social processes for crime and justice using artificial intelligence. Because again, if it isn't helping us to improve, it's not making a difference. An interesting feature, and you'll see that this permeates through several of the discussions, was discussing around how machines might be involved in courtroom decisions, criminal investigations, and so forth. And there was real consensus amongst the group that the final decision should always be human. Machines should only serve as referees and not decision makers. Quite like that analogy that's emerged from that discussion, because you sort of think of referees, we take it to a sporting context. I'm not sure how comfortable we would feel if we had an automated referee, although some might argue in tennis, in some respects, there is an automated referee in terms of the Hawkeye system now. But you get these debates and how these tensions are starting to merge. But the group were very clear that actually when there might be serious outcomes for humans, the defendant, for example, then it is really important that it is a human who is finally making that final decision as to what the outcome might be. And also for a responsibility, there should be always a human author or owner that should be held legally accountable for however a machine should perform or the actions of the machine going through. So, for example, the simple question of saying, well, actually, who gets sued when this goes wrong? If you look at the example of self-driving cars, we've seen recent cases of unfortunately pedestrians being hit. And there is that huge liability issue of, is it the manufacturer? Is it the company that is causing the car to be on the road? So if it was Uber, are they responsible? Is the manufacturer the designer of the car? Is it the driver or the human who, the guide, if you like, who is sitting but not actually driving? Is it the AI? Is it the software developer? How do we assign liability in these contexts? And what's interesting is that many of the tech companies are positioning their new technologies as decision aids rather than decision makers, because they are worried about that liability issue and how that might be used. So if we turn to jobs and employment, one of the first things that came out of that discussion that was led by João Alveiro Caveiro from the University of Minho in Portugal was that jobs and employment are really important to us as humans for our identity and our well-being. If you ever think about this, if you go into a conversation with a new person and you've not met them before, and it's outside of a business context, quite often one of the first ways we identify ourselves is by our work and our employment. And so it just shows how fundamentally we identify, and that is ingrained with us. And the discussion on that table focused very much, started looking around jobs, but looking around HR and human resources and hiring decisions. So, for example, a pertinent area they were looking at was looking at the role of algorithms and the role of employee selection and promotion decisions, and whether things were improving people's well-being, and the risk, obviously, of some groups being disadvantaged by that. And we've seen, interestingly, the recent EU bill has actually focused on looking at artificial intelligence and ways of regulating artificial intelligence. And one of the specific areas it focused on was human resource decision making, and actually how should it be applied and whether it should be applied, because there's a recognition that in that particular example there is a real risk of bias and unfair decisions. There's also, from an ethical point of view, so perhaps sort of taking this up into a broader societal level, the discussion flagged that there's a real economic imperative for lots of organizations to seek cost-saving opportunities through automation. And that may lead to sort of essentially this commoditization of skills and competencies, that we can literally get roles from machines, that a machine can do that particular competency. And that fundamentally means that some people may lose out, because if that's their fundamental skill set, they may actually mean that obviously they're less likely to be able to have employment, and this may be, sort of cause social order inequalities and problems on that scale. So questions around, do we need, as has been debated often in the literature, new forms of income to balance this up? Do we need new solutions, so guaranteed basic income, or do we need ways of taxing robots and machines like we would tax humans? And I know that there are different parts of the world that are actually sort of exploring and sort of trying out these models, because inherently this is very much how your political and social system works, and whether organizations and whether people believe that this is even right and whether you should be allowed to do that. never mind, this obviously reflects a very European view. If we contrast it to a North American view, I imagine the view would be quite different. In terms of control, one of the aspects that we also had in that discussion was that technology was seen that it started off by being, and often starts off by being a facilitator of human work. Then it becomes a transformer of human labor, and then it starts potentially to get transforming the social order that we previously had existed. I mean, if you look to this sort of 19th century industrial revolution, we see how fundamentally the workplaces change and people's roles change, and actually the rebalance of wealth and where people were located hugely changed as well, all through a result of technology. So traditionally, we will automate repetitive work, repetitive dull work. This is ideal for automation. That makes a great answer for us, and it removes a task that we aren't particularly interested in doing, and it saves us time and effort. However, what happens when machines start to automate what we'd like to do, the jobs, the tasks we would choose to do? How does that play out? We also see over time that actually we don't get less work when these machines are introduced. Throughout the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, we've just seen a shifting of that workload, if you like, up the chain to the knowledge worker. So we're just removing workers low and down, and the technology enables this reallocation of work, but the work itself does not necessarily diminish. And so talk in the sort of 70s and 80s of technology being able to give us the shorter working week, well, we would all testify to that definitely has not delivered. And so we now hear debates around, well, AI will give us the shorter working week and things will get better. It hasn't so far been that pattern. So you would question, actually, maybe it just gives us an opportunity to get more done. And what we are seeing, and I think this is something we can probably all relate to, is actually a continuing trend that we see an increase in our rhythm of life. The more we do, the more we can pack in, the more activities we can do are all being facilitated by technology. So this is the direction that we're starting to see, this constant increasing rhythm as we go through. And responsibility. Jobs are central to human society. We know this. Back to the identity point, we actually need jobs to maintain this. And the prospect of intellectually automating all our intellectual capabilities, it really does back to those societal arrangements and challenges. So we'll have questions around what will happen when machines or AI start making decisions. Arguably, they already are. Who will vet those decisions? How will society vet those decisions? And who will be understanding what will be in the algorithm that's making these decisions? Again, questions being posed from our discussion along the way. In terms of the attention economy and the notions of attention, Christian Grimm and Heike Trottmann, both from the University of Munster, in Germany, were kind enough to sort of host this table and to focus on this. And what their discussions emerged was that attention and the attention economy, if you like, our attention is something we should now consider in economic terms as a scarce resource. And what we're seeing is this increasing use of automation through social media, so our Google, our Facebook, our consumption of information, is being actively promoted and managed, so that instead of sort of passively constructing the means of allocating our attention, so we decide whether we pick up a book, whether we pick up a newspaper, we make that decision, that we're getting our attention is being actively managed by the tools, if you like, the social media activities that we are using. So they are in control of what we are seeing. We are not so much making these decisions and influencing it. And that becomes a really interesting notion, because we get the impression that we are having our own individualized view of what I search for. So if I put a particular search term into Google or any of the other sort of search engines, I will give results and I feel like I'm getting an individualized sense. However, my search results are being influenced by the fact that the tech companies and the social media organizations are actually not giving me an individualized view necessarily, but they're basically using a global classification of information and existing personal profiles to work out what sort of things I would probably want to find. So we say this, and I know many, I suspect on the video stream, when you're teaching your students, it's like I always say, when you're searching, using Google to search the internet, you are not searching the internet. You are searching Google's funnel within that view. And there's plenty of things that you do and you don't see. And it's amazing, actually, when you start to ask different questions in the way that actually you start to realize quite how gently influenced the information that is fed to us is not necessarily as broad as it could be. And that makes it convenient, but it also means that it's being actively managed going through. So we are only being shown certain things along the way. In terms of an ethics point of view, we need, if we are able to keep individuals in the loop, then we can start to understand where we see these conflicts occurring. So we're starting to say, I mean, my first point, if you like, was that actually we're seeing conflicts and we're seeing managed attention. Actually, there's a flip side to this. So it seems like all of this is so bad. AI is not helping us. AI is giving us information overload. We aren't making a difference. But actually, if we could keep humans in the loop and understand where those conflicts occur, then using AI might be a really effective way of managing this challenge and making sure that it actually becomes the solution rather than the problem. That in itself may mean, great, actually, we become more positive towards this use of AI, and it actually could improve what we're doing. The other interesting thing, talking about the economic aspect of sort of attention aspect, is the focus that what we've seen is this emergence of new economic models based on the attention mining of users and customers. So essentially, as users, we are paying with our attention when we use these so-called free services offered online. They're not free, we've just paid for it by giving them our attention. And ironically, to retrieve our personal attention, we must then pay again. But this time we have to pay financially. What this means from the social media companies is that it delivers an almost unlimited stream of monetary transactions. It's a fantastic business model because we are paying to get our attention back. And who would have thought we'd ever end up in this place? And the third point in terms around, the fourth point around responsibility, unconditional trust in machines. If we allow and trust these machines and algorithms completely to help us manage this, and if we give them unconditional trust, what it means is that we are starting to neglect our own decisions and the need for our own critique of how I spend my time and how you spend your time. And the discussions on Christian's table really concluded that actually it is essential that the human must hold responsibility with how that time is allocated. We must be paying enough attention, if you like, to what we're doing. And I think when you think about how your phone grabs your attention, how various devices are always competing and giving you information, I do think it is interesting just to take a step back and think, to what extent are you choosing to refresh Facebook, or are you just doing it by habit? And is that actually just what Facebook wants you to do, rather than you deciding, no, actually, I'll put it down. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to read a book. And our fourth theme, well-being. That was studied by Katrin Berginer, Armin Stein, and Jörg Becker. Also, all of them from the University of Munster in Germany. And their discussions focused on a different area, really. Sort of, they started on with a situation of bias in disaster response situations, so earthquakes, buildings collapsing, and so forth. And in that scenario, they sort of thought, well, how might an algorithm work? And they envisage a situation that might help medical workers prioritize their action. So an algorithm might, you rush to a situation, it's emergency, there are lots of casualties, you need to decide who should I prioritize, who should I focus on first, who is the most sort of deserving and priority area for delivering urgent care. And maybe an algorithm could help medical workers in the sense of actually not asking them to make that decision, not asking them to live with the burden of making that decision, but actually the algorithm allocates where they go and dictates that. But of course, then the immediate question that I imagine immediately comes to your mind is, well, yes, but does that make the right decision? How would you feel about an AI making that decision going through? Is it done based on injury? Is it done on age? Is it done on reliable data? At what point might data be available to make it? How would the patient feel if they know, if they are, the casualty in the scene, how would they feel if they know that your healthcare responder may or may not be coming to you based on an algorithmic decision going through? And what is the risk around bias potentially skewing that? So they identified in the discussions, it's an obvious area where it could really be helpful, but it's very problematic in terms of actually being able to ensure that the decision making is socially acceptable and, again, not biased in some way. From an ethical point of view, this was raised some really interesting questions around how algorithms might be used and how AI might be used. So, the groups were very clear. Machines should not be responsible for life or death decisions in terms of healthcare going through. But there was also recognition that actually this became a lot more complex when we're not quite talking around a life or death decision. And of course, you can argue, when does something become a life and death decision? But if you take an example, look at social care provision. So for elderly people, in that situation, machines were very much not perceived as positive. So they had visions of faceless robots looking after your elderly grandmother. This is an image that the group felt deeply uncomfortable with and thought, no, that this can't be done. However, from performing surgical procedures, the AI was seen as wholly positive. This is a great solution, largely because of the strengths. Ironically, it's the same strengths of AI that make it suitable for one. So in a surgical situation, it's good because it doesn't get distracted, there's no emotion, there's no tiredness. But put it to the flip side of, in a care context, the fact that it has no emotion, it doesn't get distracted, it doesn't engage with it, so it is an absolute no, it shouldn't be used in that context. So it's actually its strengths then potentially work against it, depending on the setting and depending on the type of care that's being delivered. So it was interesting, that challenge of actually working out, well, when should you use AI and how in that particular context. In terms of control, they also posed a really interesting debate around responsibility of being healthy. And actually, should you allow your AI system to be informing you and you as an individual on making good, healthy decisions to avoid putting additional pressure on a healthcare system? So, and, if you happen to decide to eat, I don't know, sort of 20 burgers in a week, you're eating huge, terribly unhealthily, this is your choice. But should should your Fitbit or your device actively be alerting society to know that you are eating so badly and this is not good for you? Or should it be alerting you to, you have a responsibility, you should change your behavior? So what counts more? Our freedom of choice or society's greater good? What should we do the balance? And the chances are, again, that is going to debate is going to play out completely differently, depending on what part of the world you're in, what political system you're under, and what your views are going through. So that raised a really interesting perspective on actually who has responsibility, where should the control sit? However, also touching on responsibility, the fourth point going through was that, again, there was a very clear sense of actually fundamentally responsibility for our well-being should always sit with the human. It should always be us. It should always be our responsibility to look out for our well-being. And it is in our personal interest to do that. And we should not be delegating that to AI and algorithms and other technologies as we go through. So those are a very brief overview of the key points that came through in terms of our discussions on those four main themes. I'll now briefly sort of recap on some of the key research agenda items that we saw for information systems research emerging from those areas. And again, you can find these in more detail and revisit these in the paper. But you'll get the same point. So in terms of crime and conflict, how can machines be calibrated to make socially acceptable predictions of human behavior, avoid that unseen bias? But and avoiding making what might be considered logically sound decisions, but actually socially undesirable ones. Can we actually think of ways to keep humans in better decision-making loops? And how do we need to design the institutional responsibility so they can recognize the risk of data set manipulation and bias? How do you make sure that actually, even when you've got humans in those decision-making positions, that they are aware of the risks? So what sort of training do human justice system stakeholders need? How do we train them in such a way? And also, at what point, if again, back to that liability issue, who is going to be responsible for the machine's contribution to legal decision-making? Who is the liability? How do we apportion responsibility for that machine? Again, it's back to, is it the software developer? Is it the lawmaker? Is it the government going through? Who should sit with that? Who should pay for that software? In terms of jobs, again, unsurprisingly, you'll no doubt come to this conclusion. Listen to me. How should job selection and promotion algorithms be designed for fair and equitable decisions? How do we make sure they're responsible? And what are the skills that people gain and lose from working with these machines, these technologies? How can we make sure that actually people are having more enriched work as they go through? How should organizational schemas be designed so to try and avoid reducing inequalities and social fissures? That's a huge question. And that's a government and policy level decision to decide, well, actually, do you leave incentives to try and sort of perhaps retain jobs in certain areas, even if automation is available? But from an organizational perspective, actually, how do you decide which tasks do you focus on? Which areas do you focus on? What should be done by a machine? To what degree should it be automated? And also, how might AI machines be vetted in the workplace? And again, whose interests are they working in? In terms of attention, how can we respond to those information filtering challenges? I mean, I've already spoken around the challenge of information overload coming at it. How can we also use technology to help us sort of defend ourselves against this information overload, but also retain some independence from it? That's an interesting challenge and tension between the two. Will technology always become that dominant, that self-reinforcing spiral of technology support and the attention economy? Are we always going to have to use technology to sort of help manage what we're getting in terms of information flow? Some questions around trust, and actually, can trust be designed into this new generation of AI machines so that we can recognize the risks associated with the exploitation of attention? And also, again, do we need some form of regulation for assessing challenges and opportunities and the risks associated with distribution mechanisms of human attention? So this type of things that the EU are trying to do. And fourth, well-being. How can we make sure that AI can be designed to work well in safety critical environments to provide unbiased and socially acceptable decisions? How can we determine whether conditions are suitable for AI deployment in various settings? The care home versus the surgery are a good example of actually, we need to think about, it's not the same in every situation. It's almost certainly not the same in every country or even every region. So how do we take that into account, especially when there's certain parts of the world which is really designing and going very ahead in terms of China and the US, in terms of how AI is being developed? How do we account for the dynamic nature of people's varying attitudes to AI deployments in these settings? Again, sometimes we like them, sometimes we don't. We have different attitudes, and our attitudes do not remain consistent over time. So how can we do that? And also in terms of the jobs from employment and identity and well-being, how do we ensure that technological unemployment actually doesn't undermine our sense of identity and well-being? So my final slide, I return to my original question at the start of the presentation, which poses the question, so what is it about humanity that we cannot give away to intelligent machines? And you'll have got a sense from the presentation of the tour of taking you through the different areas. We've raised far more questions than delivered answers. But I think three main themes really come through and are very clear in terms of how we need to go about this. It is absolutely essential that humans retain the ability to critique the design and application of AI and the intelligent machines it creates. So it's very critical that we have that opportunity to keep a perspective going away, keeping arguing, and making sure that we challenge the adoption of AI along the way, and we challenge the design of AI and how it should be produced. And in order to maintain that critique, it's critical that human involvement is maintained in the loop of intelligent machine decision-making process. How do we make sure human involvement is always retained there? How can we keep that sense of control in automated decision-making? And third, the ability to interpret and explain intelligent machine-making processes, decision-making processes. So how can we make sure that we must hold on to that ability to have explainable AI and go through? We need those three areas. So whenever sort of we see the EU regulation, if you like, coming through, and that's focusing on very specific use cases, which I thought was it. And I think that is very noble and very understandable as how that focuses, and they highlight some very important areas, but actually it's not very helpful. And you kind of need to focus far more on things like principles, such as principle of critique, principle of human involvement, principle on the ability to interpret and explain. We need to hold on to those sorts of principles and apply that across how AI is being applied across the field in order to preserve our humanity for the future. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Crispin. That was most interesting. Professor Yogesh, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, very insightful, and actually it raises lots of things that we as scholars, as well as actually citizens and individuals, need to be aware of, and maybe keep thinking. And one thing Crispin wonders me, you know, one of the bias was that we need to actually be very careful in terms of how we calibrate machines to avoid bias. And it just kept me thinking, is it the machine we need to calibrate, or is it us who we need to calibrate? Because obviously our biases are filtering in the machine. Sure. And if we obviously focus on machine, so like I go back to your starting point, new humanism. So focus should be on human, not on the machine. And same way, actually, when we are talking about bias, I think the focus should be on how we should avoid bias creating in the machine, rather than how we can avoid bias in the machine. So it's just the kind of a small observation that I, you know, kind of been thinking through since the beginning. But thank you very much. Very insightful talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I would agree, actually. I think that's a very good way of pointing about it and thinking about it, because the risk is that we essentially end up codifying and making giving AI our own problems. And I do think, yes, it is a sense of, and actually it is a call to us, as we continue to do, but we need to, and we see it with the Me Too movement, we see it with Black Lives Matter, and it's sort of actually there is so much inherent bias in what we do as humans in the world that we need to get better ourselves, and perhaps AI is just the manifestation of our own inadequacies at the moment. So yes, getting back to actually focusing on us, I think is really important.
Dr. Crispin, with your permission, if I can pick up a couple of questions from the chat box.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we have a question from Laurie Hughes. Thank you, Crispin. Very informative. Do you feel that the concerns and risks of the emergence of AI amongst the general population is perhaps the same feelings of people and intellectual debates back in the first industrial revolution, as mechanization meant that people needed to reskill and take on newer roles? Why do you feel that the emergence of AI is different to previous transitions and periods of historical change and disruption?
It's a good question. And actually, in some respects, I think there are synergies with the previous industrial revolution. But the difference this time is the type of work that is being automated and changing and potentially being eroded, because we've moved up the value chain in some respects. So it's now sort of the knowledge work and things that traditionally we would have thought were safe from automation, that we wouldn't automate. And I think that presents a really interesting debate, because I suppose now we've seen, as a response to the 19th century, we've seen that emergence, and over sort of the last 50 years, the emergence of the knowledge worker. And now we're seeing the threat. You know, suddenly the knowledge worker is the equivalent of the agricultural worker in the 19th century, and actually how they respond. I think the interesting aspect also that makes this different is the capability of AI in terms of its learning and own learning and changing and problem-solving capability that we've not seen before. So previous technologies were static in that respect. They would not change and they would not evolve. Whereas now sort of AI offers that opportunity and also that challenge, because that's a whole different challenge to understand actually how can we manage a machine that can potentially think for itself in some respects and adjust its decision making, and how can we keep a handle on that? So I think that's where that concern arises. Plus we've got sort of a lot of popular culture that paints a mixed view actually around the future of technology. And so we see both friends in C-3PO and R2-D2 and enemies in Terminator and the T-1000. But we have those sorts of extreme images, but they come very easily to mind. Which again, that's actually possibly somebody could debate with this on, is whether even that availability information is completely different during this transition.
Yes, Professor Yogesh.
With Crispin's permission, I just want to add that I think it's just the nature of the technology. You know, as he said, that the previous generation of technology is very static. They didn't have possibility to evolve at same level as human. But today, this technology, actually what we are more threatened, more apprehensive about, that the technology actually may become better than us. Technology may control us, but while other technologies, previous technologies, be it internet, be it all sorts of things that we have seen in the past, computer or anything, none of those technologies had that ability, or either we've seen any such thing in them, and therefore our apprehensions, our kind of thinking was limited to the threat that it only take away some jobs. It wouldn't control us. But now, actually, the situation is that technology actually can control us and may control us in the near future. None of us is certain about. If you look at Elon Musk, if you look at few other top leaders, they're openly saying how risky, how dangerous, how harmful this technology is. But at the same time, other people also saying positive side of it. So we really don't know about technology. We don't know how it will evolve. And again, where that's where this whole control, regulation, governance will come into play. So yeah, I think it's just the nature of technology that make it different from previous transitions.
Very true, very true. I mean, my mind goes back to that point where tractors got invented and all the farmers sat around the fire talking to themselves, what's going to happen to us? And you look at today's tractor, which can probably tell you how long to plow, how deep to plow, which areas to go in, and it can actually help you to do all of those. And the other point, alluding to what you said, Professor Yogesh, there's a beautiful film called The Social Dilemma, where the makers have gone and interviewed all the creators of AI. And this also alludes to Crispin's point, where he mentioned that we are thinking, and when we search, we are thinking in a way where we are being fed certain kinds of information based on our profiles. And that perhaps is a little scary. So there's this beautiful film called The Social Dilemma. Some of you may have already seen it, but it kind of puts in context all of these issues that we are talking about, some of them even ethical. It's the top of the hour. I just want to ask Dr. Crispin if he has a few minutes extra time to pick up a couple of more questions.
Yes, I'm good.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So we have a question from Galina Kondrateva. So Galina says, to continue the previous question, what do you think? Can the use of AI result in so-called technological elitism when limited number of people can really understand how this technology works compared to all users? And thank you very much for the very interesting talk.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the compliment. I think inevitably there is a risk of technological elitism as you describe it in the question. I mean, I think there will be certain people, I mean, this is the challenge in the sense that actually there are only so many people, because these are complex systems that require complex programming skills and, you know, complex decision making. And we're seeing this in a lot of businesses and organizations. I think there's a recent paper published in MRSQ Executive, which summarized some of the challenges organizations had. And one of the first challenges was actually organizations, business managers working out what AI could do and how it could make decisions and how it couldn't. So there was a real learning and training opportunity just on those simple basic terms. So if you then extrapolate that out and sort of say, well, you know, business managers who are looking to use technology are struggling to understand what it is truly capable of. And they're asking, in some respects, foolish decisions of it, you know, and requests of it because it can't deliver these sorts of capabilities and that sort of decision making. And it depends on your data. But if you extrapolate that out to society, then yes, absolutely, there may well be some people who don't have that knowledge and that confidence. And then it becomes a far more broader societal responsibility of governments and policymakers to ensure that, you know, AI is being used in a responsible way. Because I think we're already seeing sort of a lot of the knowledge in terms of the capabilities of what you could do with information and social media data and big data. Again, that is held with a relatively small number of people are truly underappreciating quite the capabilities of what you can find out and how you can drill down and how you can individualize the certain people. So is there a risk of it? Yes, I would say so. But I also think it's unrealistic. We're not going to get the world to suddenly, you know, we're not all going to become programmers and we're not all going to get engaged with that. So we need to think about societal ways to actually make sure that these technologies are used responsibly.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question, Dr. Crispin. So we have a question from Efpraxia Zamani, who asks, in terms of the bias in algorithms, considering that funding bodies place a focus on responsible research and innovation, what are your thoughts on practitioners' efforts to implement more ethical approaches in their coding? Is it working?
That's a good question, Praxi. I think it's reassuring in the sense that we are making the calls for responsible programming and responsible ethics there. Of course, the million-dollar question is, how do we check? and how do we make sure that actually this is truly being enacted? And I think this is where you get to challenges around, if you look at around things like explainable AI and the different ways of being able to explain AI. And I think there's two debates of obviously trying to understand what is going on inside the black box, but another way of checking it is to judge, you know, what went in and what comes out in terms of decision making, and actually can we judge its validity in that respect? So maybe it's thinking around different ways of trying to ensure, how do we check, how do we test responsible coding practices, responsible applications of this are truly being tested. So maybe our advance really ought to be around sort of testing regimes and regulation and governance mechanisms, as well as putting this request in, because we can request it, but I think sort of the truth is actually, yes, we want it. And I think as the question implies, how well is it going? Well, actually, if there's a cynicism in there sort of thinking, I don't think it's going that well, then therefore sort of, well, and so what are we doing about it? Just asking for something doesn't necessarily mean we'll get it. And also, of course, lots of organizations will, you know, do the right thing and say the right thing and make it look like they're doing the right thing. But actually, it's our checks and balances and how do we check effectively that makes the real difference here, and whether we'll live in a more socially acceptable and desirable world, in which we need to. So checks and balances is my answer. That's what we need.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Yogesh, last thoughts?
No, not really. Thank you very much, Crispin. We're really grateful for such a wonderful talk. And I'm sure that many of us might pick up some aspect of your paper and this talk to take further in terms of empirical work or further research work. So it's been really valuable in terms of making people aware. You know, all these aspects, job and other three areas that you picked up, all four areas are very, very important for us as a society and individuals. So how is going to impact, and what impact that will have over a long period of time, I think need to be examined. And you have opened up this line and let's see how many of us pick up those. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor Bhattacharya, for your...
My pleasure, my pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Crispin. Thank you, Professor Yogesh. Thanks to all our participants. And it was a very interesting session, very lucid narrative from Dr. Crispin. And we were buzzing with questions. I would also like to thank our IT infrastructure team led by Rajesh Bhagewadi for a very smooth infra for the entire session. And last but not the least, our hardworking iSmart team at SIBM Pune. Professor Crispin, they'll send you out a few thank you electronic frames in a few minutes from now. And if you visit us here, you would get it as you're walking off the stage. They are that quick about it. And I would also like to share that we have the last seminar in this series coming up next week. And it's an hour before, so it's at 12 noon UK time, where we will hear a couple of researchers, one of them from Arizona State University and the other one from Australia, two different parts of the world altogether. So we look forward to that. It'll be wonderful if you can join us, Dr. Crispin. And thank you once again. Have a very good afternoon, and look forward to seeing you soon and hosting you in the not too distant future.